Jeff, it's Dennis Gray from the Australian Rock Show. How are you, mate?
Dennis, how you doing?
We've got you on the show when the world's media, due sadly to the passing of Malcolm Young, have AC/DC back in the spotlight and then some, which, as I mentioned in my intro, is renewing interest in the band's music. That's a great thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, it is. It's just in the most unfortunate of circumstances. You know, I think about the book that I wrote, and when I wrote it, I called it, High Voltage, Angus Young, The Last Man Standing, and it was certainly meant in relation to the band, not in relation to, his entire life. So I feel a little bit awkward and uncomfortable about the subtitle of my book because, not that I'm saying there's any kind of weird karmic happenings going on, but it just feels a bit awkward now to be looking at a study I wrote about one man and realise that it takes in his whole family and really we are witnessing, the end of sort of musical rock and roll empire. And it's heartbreaking. There was a photo of Angus in this morning's newspaper standing outside the church in Sydney holding Malcolm's guitar and his guitar case, and I've never seen a more forlorn figure. It was a really tragic, heartbreaking image.
It was a very, very touching send-off, I think. Now, you've written a whopping 20 books, Jeff, and I've read a couple of your previous titles, such as the ones on Mark Hunter, Shirl, and both Michael Brownings and Mark Evans, which you assisted on. What made you want to write about Angus?
I think it was the simple fact, well, actually, no, there was a number of facts. It was that no one had really concentrated on him. Bon Scott is typically and understandably the focus of a lot of writers' attention because his story is, juicy and unavoidable, and it's got all the stuff that writers really like to dive into. And it's also, quite unfortunately, Bon's story has a full stop. It has a conclusion because of his tragic death. But I thought that Angus had been just a little bit overlooked in the whole history of AC/DC because, let's face it, once Bon was gone, Angus really moved centre stage. And as good as Brian Johnson has been, the new guy in the band of, 35-odd years standing, Angus, I think, really became the focal point and the main draw card of the band, if you will, over the last, 30-odd years. So I thought it was a really good opportunity to focus on him. It also was written at a time when the whole Rock or Bust tour was becoming, despite its incredible commercial success, was becoming a bit of a nightmare for Angus. Brian Johnson having to give up midway, Phil Rudd being, on home detention, Cliff Williams deciding that he was going to pull up stumps. There was a lot of drama, and I thought it was just a good, timely opportunity to write about someone who, I was a kid growing up in Sydney in the 70s, the whole countdown and that halcyon days of live music, so I really knew the stuff inside out. And also, having worked with Mark and Michael, as you mentioned in your question, it really gave me a great insight and much, kind of gave me access to information that I thought I really should not pass up the opportunity to be able to write about this if the opportunity ever came up. So, I was really lucky and I really enjoyed doing it. But as I say, it's taken on a really kind of tragic aftertaste, if you will, because of all what's happened in the last couple of months.
I thought the Rock or Bust tour ended without much fanfare, didn't it? I mean, I'm not saying it fizzled out, but as you mentioned, Cliff stepped out of the spotlight pretty quietly, not the way he would have wanted to, I guess, without Malcolm and Brian. And, of course, you had Axl Rose up there in his throne. It was all a little unpredictable, I guess.
Yeah, it was a strange ending. Look, I think so much of it is about Angus's his background, his upbringing. He said in one of the rare interviews that he's done recently, he said, we were committed to doing a tour, and it's like anything else they do and anything else they've done since 1974. If they're committed to doing something, it's instilled in them as, working class guys. They've got to get the job done. And you think about the obstacles he had to overcome just to finish that tour. It was huge. It really was. But there's just something about the Youngs in particular, the remaining Youngs, tragically, but, when Malcolm was at his best and George as well, if there was a job to be done, they went and did it. They'd do AC/DC records in 2 weeks' time. They'd tour for 18 months, 24 months, 3 years, whatever was required, because that was what they did. And, there was a great quote from Malcolm talking about, I'm no superstar. To me, this is just a 9-to-5 job. It's what I do. I'm a working musician. And, Angus has maintained that. And, in fact, one of Angus's, final tributes to Malcolm, he said, job well done. and that really summed them up. They were working guys, and I just couldn't imagine Angus midway through a tour pulling the pin. And obviously there's, think about an AC/DC tour now, there's huge financial repercussions if they decided to blow out 20 dates or something. It would be monumental just because of the scope of the way of their shows these days. The circus comes to town when AC/DC plays, and it's a big, big production. Hundreds of crew, lots of people involved, hundreds of thousands of ticket sales. It's a big cost to say, no, sorry, we have to cancel the show. So, Angus found a way to get through it. It did take on a bit more of a kind of carnival, bizarre kind of, I'm not going to say freak show, that's not fair, because I think Axl Rose actually did a really, really good job. But it did take on a slightly different feeling to a typical AC/DC show, that's for sure.
Let me get off the subject of AC/DC for a bit, because I was just going through a list of titles of which you've written, and I noticed that you've written a book about rugby league, haven't you? And there's often a link. There's often a link I've found between Australian rock and roll and rugby league. Both of those interests were what a large part of the population followed. I guess the lifestyle in the 60s, 70s and 80s, at least in Sydney and the East Coast, you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Steve Mascourt's written a really good book about that, actually, mixing the two. And, he's a classic example of a guy who used to write about music who now writes about footy. Well, I was brought up, Sydney, western suburbs, born in the early 60s. It was the era of, South Sydney and St George and Canterbury, all these great suburban teams, And my dad, every Saturday, would take my two brothers and I to the SCG for the match of the day. And I have such vivid memories of that. And I guess that was probably that. And, rugby league in the winter and cricket in the summer were my first loves. And then when I got a little older in my early teens, I really got into music. And like I said earlier, it was just such a heyday for Australian music, that period into the mid-70s, as I was getting to the, legal drinking age, and there were these great venues. But, before then it was rugby league for sure. And I wanted to write a book. I just didn't want to write a traditional, I pick a subject and write a biography of them. I wanted to write about some of these characters who, to me, people like Jack Gibson and Harry Barth were kind of a bit larger than the players in their team. I really liked them. So, yeah, they're and as I'm sure you talk to a lot of rock and rollers, and they're as interested in sport as they are in music. I think the guys in Powderfinger would rather be in the Australian cricket team than they ever been in a band. So there's definitely a bridge. There's a crossover between sport and rock and roll in Australia, particularly. Yeah.
Well, let's get back onto the topic of Angus, and I'd like your comments. We've touched on it, on the recent passing of Malcolm. As we said, not unexpected, as he'd been ill for some time, but his passing still saddened so many of us, and some of the images from his funeral yesterday were, as I mentioned, very touching. And I guess that's a reminder that not only was Mal a rock and roll hero to so many, but a dad, brother, husband as well.
Yeah. Just trying to be as regular a guy as someone in an irregular job like his could be. One of the funny. One of the funny moments, and, we've all been to funerals and we all hope that there's just a bit of levity in every serious and somber funeral. And, God, I know when I go, I hope there's a few jokes told. But one of Malcolm's nephews said that he recalled how Malcolm used to love shopping at Gowings. Now, anybody who knows Sydney, Gowings isn't there anymore, but it's one step up from Lowe's. It's a working man's clothes store. It was down on the corner of Market Street, right in the centre of the city, and it just sold, affordable men's clothing. And that's where Malcolm would buy his black T-shirts, his blue singlets, and his blue jeans. And, here's a man with hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank would still like to shop at Gowings. I thought it was a really lovely, touching moment. And it just, further highlights what I've been talking about these were guys who were trying as hard as they possibly could to remain as grounded as they possibly could, who never got above their station, who never became, rock and roll wankers or superstars, never trod the red carpet, never hung around the green room. They just got on with what they had to do, be it away from the stage or on the stage. And, it's a pretty commendable thing and pretty rare too. Let's face it. You mentioned Axl Rose before. Well, there's rock and roll lived on a very kind of high advanced level, isn't it? It's a complete lifestyle. Whereas for these guys, the Youngs, it was what they did. They could have been mechanics. They really could have been, but they just chose to play the guitar, and they loved it, and they did it brilliantly, and, they created this amazing dynasty and musical legacy. So, again, job well done.
Well, sadly, and you touched on this earlier with Malcolm and George now departed, your title phrase in your book, Last Man Standing, is ironic, but even before that, I imagine it must have been very hard for Angus, when Mal had left the band some time back, to look over stage right after thousands of gigs together and not see his brother there. That would be tough.
Yeah, and it's no coincidence that the nephew Stevie was brought into the band, for a number of reasons. Obviously, he knew the songs inside out, but it was still family, and I think that was very deliberate and a very smart move on Angus's part, because at least it still felt a bit like the old form, the old band, if you like. And Stevie had toured because I think it was in the late 80s when Malcolm went into rehab. So he wasn't unfamiliar to being on stage in that kind of huge environment that AC/DC now play. But yeah, it must have felt different. It really had. And, and also Phil Rudd not there anymore, and just, which makes you wonder, and I'm sure we'll get onto this, but it does make you wonder how Angus can keep this, this beast rolling along. And obviously it's way too soon for him to deal with anything beyond, mourning the loss of his two brothers and grieving over that. But it does raise a very, very big question about how, in what kind of way he could continue the AC/DC juggernaut. It's a really tough and unanswerable question, I think.
Well, I've seen comments online from fans who'd like Phil Rudd, Cliff Williams and Brian to join Angus and Stevie for a run of big farewell shows, and I hope, I would like that to happen as a fan. I hope Angus continues on and keeps the band going. Who knows, maybe the passing of Mal and George will unite the band, who knows?
Yeah, well, I mean, Axl Rose has been talking about doing other stuff with Angus under the AC/DC banner, so that hasn't been ruled out, and they seem, if it's anything to go by, the simple fact that Angus turns up at Guns N' Roses gigs, which is something he's never done in the past for any other band. Okay, with the exception of the Stones in 2003, I think it was, but, that was an invitation to come and play. This is different. Angus actually hangs out at Guns N' Roses shows. It's very uncommon, which suggests there's something brewing between the two of them. But, yeah, what you say would be great. I mean, if Brian Johnson's hearing's up to it and Phil Rudd isn't wearing an ankle bracelet and, all those things, the idea of a final lap of honour would be brilliant and really quite poignant, I think. But then again, they're not the kind of guys that do the big gesture, if you know what I mean, the big emotional gesture. They do the big gesture on stage, they put on the big rock show, but they're not the kind of guys that would go for the, emotional hit with their audience. I don't know. It's hard to kind of, it's hard to put it in words how they are, but that kind of gesture would be, it would be great and really powerful. It's sort of not in their nature at the same time. So it's hard to say. And, of course, AC/DC being so incredibly insular and private about business and private affairs, which you've got to really admire. They keep things very much to themselves. They will let you know when they're touring and when they're making a new record, and that's pretty much it. So we're going to be the last to know, and it's going to be sudden. And when an announcement's made, it's going to be happening pretty soon. So yeah, God, I'd love to see them do that. Yeah, time will tell. I mean, it would be great. You're right. I mean, to get the equivalent of the old band back together for one final lap, I think would be pretty powerful. But whether Angus would see that as being a bit too, kind of milking it a bit, it's hard to say. Really hard to say. But it'd be a hell of a tour.
Agreed. Actually, you've got a cool story in your book about your first AC/DC gig, which was actually listening in from outside their Haymarket show
the other
in
side
Sydney
of a brick wall.
In January
of
77.
True. Well, again, Sydney in the 70s. It was. I would have been 15, so it was, and it was January. I remember it was around the Australia Day or a little bit after that, probably the end of the school holidays, actually. And this is a typical, and I'm sure, plenty of other people my age and from my background would nod their head in agreement. But, you'd get into the city, because I lived out in the suburbs, you'd get into the city and you'd get to a pub where the oldest of your group would be able to sneak in and buy beers for everybody else. And typically we'd always find out who was playing where and could we get in. And we're in a pub in Sydney and we heard that, AC/DC. And AC/DC to us then, we knew their music, but we would have been more we've been seeing them on Countdown probably, all those great early clips, High Voltage and so on, and also, Baby Please Don't Go, where Bond rocked up in drag and stuff like that. So we knew them as kind of a, I won't say comic band, but, slightly cartoonish band, I guess, from the time. But we found out they were playing at the Haymarket. So great. And we also got the name, and this is another thing that used to happen to us all the time, we got the name of the guy on the door. The guy who, if you slipped a $5 to, was going to get you inside. And of course, he didn't exist. But we'd had a few drinks, and we got down to the Haymarket. And of course, when we asked for this guy, everybody gave us that look like, kid, the train station's that way, you should go home now. But we were huge music fans, and I still am. And we hung around. And so my first experience of Angus and the band was from the other side of a brick wall. The good thing is they played so loud that we could hear them really, really well.
Well, that was
and then I found myself 20-odd years later, standing down the road at the entertainment centre watching them and flashing back to that. And I thought, it's the distance that they travelled is just, and the success they have is just so phenomenal. It's they probably would be arguably, the world's biggest rock band, certainly of the last, in commercial terms, as far as concert ticket sales, the last 10 or 15 years. I think they've outdone the Stones. It's huge how big they've become. So, yeah, it was a great moment, and I just remember standing on the other side of that brick wall thinking, man, they must be really good because they're so damn loud,
Well, that was the Giant Dose of Rock and Roll tour, wasn't it? And there's a pretty cool soundboard recording of that show, which is worth hunting down. And interesting how AC/DC was still including the very first single, Can I Sit Next to You, Girl, in the set on that tour too.
Yeah. And a lot of those songs are still in their set list today, of course. So, it says so much about the strength of that Bon Scott era songs, which, that's my era of AC/DC. I can quite happily live without anything post for those about to rock, frankly. I mean, there's odd songs, Thunderstruck and so on, but, I really think they were at their peak when Bon was there writing those, fantastic, funny and really insightful lyrics. And, Angus and Malcolm were probably at their creative best, yeah. With George Young there, of course, pulling the strings.
Your book mentions this, so do others, and it's an interesting observation that Angus was quite nervous on stage in the earliest days, wasn't he? Yet he obviously clearly overcame that and then some. And I can recall watching him at Donington in 1991 in front of a massive, massive crowd and just being astonished by the way he could command such a large mass of people, not just there but other big concerts as well, via his stage presence and guitar work only. Yeah, and he took his cues from the greats, when Chuck Berry died, Angus was quite vocal about how the duck walk, obviously, that he uses on stage was a Chuck Berry lift, a homage to Chuck, and also the idea of sort of conducting the crowd with his guitar. He says that's something he'd seen Chuck Berry do, and, to play slowly and then pick up the pace and have the crowd chant that back at you, that kind of stuff. So that was really interesting. But, yeah, in the start, he had this bizarre idea that if he wore a school uniform and moved about the stage really quickly, no one would notice him. And I always thought, thinking back on that, they're the two things that will get you noticed. But he also did say that he moved around on stage a lot to avoid getting hit with bottles and cans, which was a fair call, all things considered. In fact, at one stage he'd asked Michael Browning, their manager, to have them have a cage erected around them as they played, because he said it would be much safer. And I can imagine approaching a publican with that concept. High Voltage also talks briefly about Angus's pre-AC/DC outfits, Kentucky and Tantrum. Did your research unearth anything interesting about them? Any demos or anything? Because I know Vander and Young had put Tantrum down on reel to reel, hadn't they? Yeah, I think you'd have to have the key to the Albert's archive to find that one. And although I know some people at Albert's, I wasn't quite that close, but I'd love to dig them out. Purely because it'd be the continuum between, the Marcus Hook Roll Band and early AC/DC, Kentucky and Tantrum. And I think Malcolm might have done some recording with the Velvet Underground as well, the band he was in with Herm Kovac. So it'd be great to hear that stuff just for historical sake, just to go, okay, here's the evolution of the band. And you're right, there were some recordings made, but, they'd be buried away in the archive somewhere. And I'm sure, knowing, Albert's ongoing relationship with Angus, so maybe one day they'll see light of day. I hope so. I'd love to hear it. There are some photos of Kentucky around, and Angus had really long hair and looked like he just looked like a younger version of the Angus that we know, frankly. But, without having heard much of their music, they would have been a band just finding their sound. They did a lot of covers.
they did mountain, covers and things like that, and I think Free and bands like that were pretty much, the go-to rock bands at that time. But it'd be great to hear what was kind of cooking. I mean, I know you said in a previous show that Marcus Hook Roll Band is a really good snapshot of what was to become, both with Harry and George's production with AC/DC and AC/DC themselves, and it's really true. You were absolutely right that a lot of those songs on that record either sound like earlier versions of or stepping stones to later AC/DC songs. So, so hopefully one day that part of the puzzle will be filled in.
Well, we need to acknowledge the influence of, obviously, older brother George Young on both Mal and Angus, especially when they were lapping up, or what they were lapping up during the Easy Beats heyday. Very important to both of them, wasn't it, in terms of attitude and how to do it, and which they still bear resolve as the years
I'm loving that. Yeah, I'm loving the Friday on My Mind mini-series because for a number of things. I just think it's really well done and really interesting and a real kind of, rock and roll boys' own adventure. But there's a great moment, and it's probably apocryphal, but it doesn't matter really, where we flash back. The Easy Beats are just, Easy Fever is catching on, and they flash back to the home in Burwood, and there's Malcolm and Angus sitting in front of the TV strumming their guitars, and Malcolm saying, "No, not like that, do it like this." And I know from the hundreds of interviews and all the research I did for this book that certainly Malcolm was, a guiding light when it came to teaching Angus how to play guitar, but George was really the focal point for both of them. They saw what was happening with George, and they experienced it firsthand when, teenage girls would try to burst into the house in Burwood. There's a great story of Angus, and they recreated in the miniseries where he comes home and tries to explain to the copper that he lives there. And the copper said, yeah, everybody's saying that, as chaos was reigning on this little suburban house. So they saw all that stuff, and the pop, to a kid growing up, it must have looked so exciting, this pop life. But at the same time, the music too was pretty exciting because the Easy Beats were playing the kind of music that Malcolm and Angus were into and really wanted to do. But yeah, George's role in their life couldn't be understated. It was enormous, even, beyond when they went to other producers, Mutt Lange and people like that. The fact that they went back to George eventually, I think, for Stiff Upper Lip says eons. It really does. They eventually got back to the person that they felt really understood their sound the most, and that was a big comeback record for them. So it was pretty important, and I think that was the last record that George worked on before going into retirement. So there's a lovely kind of symmetry to all that.
Jeff, I believe that before the band had settled on the name AC/DC, they'd done a gig at the Last Picture Show in Cronulla as the Younger Brothers. I know in your book on page 44, you state that coming out of AC/DC was a week-long stretch of dates in late December 73 at Checkers. I've always been under the understanding that the debut gig was on 31st of December 73 at Checkers, and Dave Evans verified that when I interviewed him a couple of years back, or have I read that wrong?
No, I mean, it's quite possible that, let's put it this way, there's quite a few different versions of when it all began, and, I looked... I've talked to Philip Morris, who photographed the gig, and, he's still going, now, when was that? Was it New Year's Eve? Was it then? Dave Evans is probably as good a source as anybody. I think I've tried my best to be as close to the actual fact. I mean, some people have told me it was the Young Brothers, not the Younger Brothers, and of course, those gigs would have been so impromptu and on such a small scale that there's no record anywhere. That's the trouble, of course. Nowadays, everything is documented, and it's easier to do research for books nowadays because, everybody's got a phone, everything's captured. Back then it was a bit more impromptu. So the Young Brothers, the Younger Brothers, I'm still a bit uncertain myself. A few people have told me that what I have is incorrect, and, unfortunately, Malcolm is probably the one that remembers the most, isn't around anymore to confirm or deny. And those guys were never really much for discussing their past. You read interviews with them, and it was always about what they're going to do next. They very rarely went, I remember this great gig at Checkers, or I remember playing the Hurstville Boys. I think I saw them at the Hurstville Civic Centre, places like that. It was never really their style to flash back. It was always about what they were going to do next. So, yeah, look, there's bound to be corrections in, future editions of my book, because it's just so hard to confirm some of those details. Even working with Michael Browning, who managed the band for many years at that really, really important stage of their career, we had to go back to various AC/DC sources to confirm dates and things like that, purely because, when you're particularly in Michael's case, when you're right in the thick of things, you're probably not keeping as clear. The details like that probably aren't as important to you as where we're going next week. What's our next gig? Who's going to pay us? What's the situation with Atlantic and America? All those things. So you try as hard as you can to get to, I don't think a writer will ever get 100% accuracy, but if you get over 90%, I think you're doing okay. And let me put it to you nice and clearly. There's lots of readers out there who are more than willing to let me know when I make a mistake.
What's your take on the Dave Evans 73-74 era? They were very much a band finding their feet, but still making their way forward, weren't they?
Yeah. I mean, I never saw that band, so and there's not much. There's not much recorded, material of them at that time. I mean, I think he did an early version of "Can I Sit Next to You," didn't he? If I'm not mistaken, I think he did the first version.
First single.
But yeah, it's a band in evolution. It's like like talking about the Beatles in Hamburg or something, isn't it? They're not. That the perfect lineup hasn't quite gelled, and to me, the perfect lineup will always be the one that was on the back of the flatbed truck rolling down Swanston Street in Melbourne. With all due respect to Cliff Williams, but Mark Evans and I have worked together, so I feel very close to the guy, and I think he was there for such an important era of the band. To me, that's the definitive lineup. Dave Evans can take a lot of credit. He was there when it all started out, and I think that's great. It's just as a fan, I guess my time with the band started when that lineup was pretty much in place, what I call the definitive lineup, and that's the stuff that I really drew on when I was writing, because you see, the majority of the book is really about that early era, and because I just think it's such an exciting time and such a kind of, not reckless, but a freewheeling kind of time for them. There was so much potential. They were fulfilling their potential, which eventually happened with Back in Black. And after that, to me, AC/DC became a bit of a brand, if you like, because they got so huge. And that's unavoidable. You can try to stay as pure to your roots and to be as grounded as you possibly can. And they did, but they still become larger than life. I'm more interested in them at that time when they were really just starting to develop,
years.
when the empire was being built, not when the empire was established, because for so many, and it's not restricted to AC/DC. You could talk about that with the Stones, the Beatles, all the biggest bands of the world. The most interesting years are the years leading up to their ultimate huge success, because that's when they're really, they're really climbing that mountain, and that's a pretty exciting thing.
There's a quote from Angus in your book which, for me, sums up his persona quite accurately, and this was made whilst talking to Richard Wilkins during the 1988 tour, which was great, by the way. I saw a bunch of those shows, and I think the Party Boys were the opening band who nailed it every night, but I'm getting off track there. Anyway, look, Angus said to Wilkins, everything's automatic these days. A kid can flick on the button on a TV and he can zoom through everything and get it coming from all over the world. But for us, the best thing as a band was always that we were great on stage. It's a very accurate comment from Angus, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And, that's the one constant. Their recording career has kind of ebbed and flowed. They, like I said, to me, the last 30 years, you could handpick a bunch of great songs that they've recorded, but none of them have had the consistency of those early records. But live, they've always been bankable. You always know you're going to get this amazing performance, particularly from Angus. You see him from the moment they begin to the final encore. He is covered. I'd love to put a tracker on him and find out how much territory he covers during a show. The story goes that he loses, I think it's up to 3 pounds a night or a couple of kilos a night in sweat. One of the great stories that was related to me, I think it was by Michael Browning, of being backstage at an early show and Angus pulling the scratch plate off his guitar and just emptying pools and pools of his own sweat onto the floor. There's a man who really, really, really puts in, and now in his early 60s, in those most recent runs of shows, nothing had changed. I mean, it would be so easy for them just to phone in a gig and just to go through the motions, as, frankly, a couple of bigger rock acts that I've seen in the last 5 or 6 years, I thought, God, why are people paid so much money for this? It was very unconvincing. But you go and see AC/DC, that last tour was as energetic and as, committed to entertaining the crowd as anything over the last 40-odd years. And and again, it's about being raised in the way they were, working-class Glasgow, working-class Sydney. They understand the ethic of really, really working hard. Angus is still, I think, locked into the mindset, and he said this in an interview, that he can't shake off the idea, and it's been with the band ever since 1973 or 74, is that if we don't play, we don't eat. Which is crazy for a guy who's worth a couple of $100 million. But he said, that's what we do, and we feel we need to fulfill that obligation of entertaining people. And there's also something that happens to Angus, I'm sure, that when he plugs in that guitar, and, I really get into this in the book, that he becomes a different person. He becomes this, human live wire, this incredibly magnetic and charismatic figure on stage. And yet, away from the stage, he's almost invisible. It's bizarre. It's almost like, and not almost like, there's a couple of Anguses. There's this kind of mild-mannered guy off stage, and there's the guy who puts on the cape, or the uniform in his case, and becomes something else again, this incredible dynamo. So it's a pretty amazing thing, particularly a guy who's getting into his 60s. Let's face it, those joints would be feeling a bit creaky these days. And yet, it doesn't seem to have changed the way he plays on stage.
What couple of songs do you think define the sound of Angus Young? Yeah,
that's good. Look, I'm not sure I'd define Angus, but there's a couple of, I love the song, Ride On. I mean, that to me is so uncharacteristic of AC/DC, and yet perfect. And it's almost make you want them to do an album of, old blues covers like the Stones did recently, because it's just so damn good. I don't know. The other day I was in a studio, ABC studio, and we were playing Riff Raff, and I'm thinking, what a killer song, what an absolute killer song. There's a lot of stuff, and again, I'm probably more inclined to re-examine. I mean, my favourite record is Highway to Hell, and I think Power Age is incredible as well. I think you could, as I said earlier, you could handpick probably a dozen songs from the last 30 years and build a pretty good album out of that as well. But I really think those records done with Vanda and Young and Highway to Hell as well were good, strong, powerful, and right to the point, cohesive albums, and which is a kind of a rare thing nowadays, I guess. But yeah, Riff Raff, Ride On, stuff like that, I think would give another side of Angus in some ways, but at the same time be pretty, the kind of songs you'd want to be buried with, if you know what I mean. The kind of songs you want to take with you to your grave. But then again, those 20 most people they still play when they perform now, and if I had the choice, I wouldn't mind those going on my tombstone as well.
Sure.
Thunderstruck TNT, Long Way, all those classics are classics for a reason. They're fantastic songs, and they stand the test of time. And in the last 15 years or so, it's been people like Dave Grohl and the guys from Metallica, and a whole bunch of more contemporary artists, and closer to home, people like The Living End and Wolfmother and Jed and the Vines. All these people coming out and championing AC/DC, I think gave them a whole new lease of life too. But they all lean on those songs, and there's guarantee that everybody from Tim Rogers to Tex Perkins to Chris Chaney and so on would have loved to have written A Long Way to the Top, that's for sure.
Well, actually, you just mentioned a whole bunch of Australian bands. There's a fantastic Sydney band I'm going to give a plug to called Release the Hounds, who are treading the same path as AC/DC very much, and put out an album this year.
That's great.
Well worth checking out if listeners want to do that. Jeff, every guest on our show gets to select a song by an Australian band. We're going to wind this interview up. What's in the works for you for 2018? A book on Malcolm, maybe, or Phil Rudd?
No, look, I feel like I don't know. I would feel a bit uncomfortable writing about Malcolm, given he's just been put in the ground. It just feels a bit too opportunistic to me. And I mean, I've written about people who have passed away. I wrote a book about Jeff Buckley and a few other people, and I always think it needs time for to be able to reflect on them fairly, if you know what I mean, and with the due respect. I'm, to be honest, for one of the rare times in my career, I'm not quite sure what I'm doing next. I've been talking so much about this book recently, and will continue to do so well into the next year. Got a lot of publicity lined up and library events and talks and things. So I'm really just focusing on this for the moment. There is, though, a chance for me to work with a really interesting guy called Dennis Dunstan, who was Fleetwood. He's an Australian guy who worked with Fleetwood Mac initially as security and ended up becoming their co-manager, and he worked with them for 20 years. And he not just worked with them, but he lived with them and was basically a member of Fleetwood Mac as you could get. A long way from AC/DC, different wood altogether, but and song-wise, well, I can't overlook High Voltage, can I? I mean, it's the name of the book after all.
Why not? Let's hear that.
Shameless plug.
Thank you for coming on the show today. Really appreciate it. The book is called High Voltage, The Life of Angus Young, AC/DC's Last Man Standing. Get it online and in bookstores across Australia. Kids, if you cannot get dad a mistress for Christmas, then this book is the next best thing. And I know that many of fans out there will enjoy reading it as much as I did. Jeff, thanks for coming on the show today, and please keep in touch.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. It was great.
For Jeff Apter, that was, of course, AC/DC with High Voltage, Young and Scott at their finest. It was also the first single lifted off the TNT album released here in Australia back in July of 1975. I hope you all got something out of that interview. Jeff's got great rock and roll knowledge, very much cut from the same cloth as the Gray Brothers, and it was cool to have him on the show today to talk some rock and roll and a whole lot of AC/DC. jeffapter.com.au is the place to visit to learn more about Jeff and some of the amazing books which he has published. Folks, it is time to get out of here. You can contact us via email at australianrockshow@gmail.com. We are on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter at AusRockShow, AUS Rock Show. Hear us at places like iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn and Mixcloud. And of course, be sure to visit our online home at australianrockshow.com for all the past episodes and lots of info on Australia's loudest and proudest rock and roll podcast. You know, this podcast is fueled on a long-time love of Australian rock and roll, and I know that many of you dig the Australian Rock Show, and for that we are truly grateful. The whole aim really is to share that love of cool rock and roll with others, to turn youngsters and new ears onto the kind of rock and roll which we dig. Please support the bands which we highlight on our podcast by seeing them live and also by purchasing their music. Keep rock and roll alive. And once again, if you love what we're doing on the Australian Rock Show, we've got a big fat donation button on our homepage at australianrockshow.com. All donations are appreciated and help us to keep this show up and running. If you donate $5 or over, we will air you a song of your choice. How cool is that? We also have a brand new bunch of t-shirts due in shortly. Have had a couple of inquiries about t-shirts, so check the Facebook page and website for an update, or email us directly, australianrockshow@gmail.com, if you want to purchase a t-shirt, and we'll send you the details. Okay, I think that's about it. Thanks once again for tuning in, folks, and you all know the drill by now. If you're listening in whilst driving, or on the bus, train, at your workplace, in your apartment, wherever you are, turn the volume up super loud so you can educate others. Lifted from their Fly on the Wall album released back in 1985, here are the boys with Shake Your Foundations. This is Dennis, out.